January 1942. Besieged Leningrad. The temperature outside Professor Orlov's apartment had dropped to minus 32 degrees Celsius, minus 25.6 Fahrenheit. But that was just an abstract number from a street thermometer, an artifact of a bygone civilization, as useless as the frozen clock on the wall. The real, true cold could not be measured. It wasn't measured in degrees. It was measured in the depth of despair. It was a living thing, a predator that had infiltrated their home not through the broken windows, but through the very walls. It saturated the air, the furniture, the clothes, and was now closing in on the last thing that was still warm, their hearts. The apartment, once a spacious professor's residence with high ceilings, stucco molding, and a vast library, had turned into an ice cave, a family crypt where its inhabitants were buried alive. Dmitry Nikolaevich Orlov, a historian, a man whose life was dedicated to studying the past, now sat on the floor in the center of the largest room, wrapped in everything that hadn't yet been burned, and watched his family. He looked at them not as a husband and father, but as a museum curator watching the last, most valuable exhibits fade away. His wife, Anna Arkadyevna, lay on the sofa, covered by a heap of blankets and an old rug. Her face, once lively and witty, had become a waxen mask, her nose sharpened, her eyes dark, sunk in hollows. She no longer complained, no longer cried or reproached him, and this silence was more terrifying than any scream. Beside her, under the same pile of rags, huddled into tiny balls, were their children. 16-year-old Katya, his brilliant, proud daughter, who still tried to hold on by reading aloud the surviving pages of Pushkin. But her voice grew quieter and weaker each day, the words freezing on her lips. And 8-year-old Misha, his son, his boy. Misha barely moved anymore. His breath was a faint cloud of vapor in the icy air of the room. It was growing rarer, shorter. Dmitry Nikolaevich knew it wasn't hunger that was killing them so quickly. Yes, they were starving. 125 grams of bread, which contained less flour than sawdust and weeds, could not sustain life. But people could endure hunger for weeks. The cold, however, killed in a matter of days, of hours. It drained life slowly, methodically, turning blood into an icy slush, stopping the heart not from exhaustion but from indifference. He looked at his hands. The fingers that had once turned the fragile pages of ancient manuscripts and written monographs were now blue, swollen, and barely bent. They had no strength. But in his mind, in his freezing, viscous consciousness, a thought still flickered. A single thought that was both salvation and madness. It had come to him several days ago, in a dream, or perhaps a delirium, when the line between reality and memory had blurred completely. He saw himself in another time, in another life. He was walking through the echoing, brightly lit halls of the Museum of Urban Life, where he had worked for almost 10 years before the university. He breathed in the smell of old wood, wax, and the dust of ages, and he stopped in front of it, in front of a small cast-iron but incredibly elegant stove from the late 19th century, with ornate patterns, a door decorated with a fairy tale bird, and carved legs. It stood in the living room of a wealthy citizen exhibit, useless, beautiful, cold, a museum piece, an object from the past. And now, sitting in the frozen hell of his apartment looking at his fading son, Dmitry Nikolaevich understood with absolute, terrifying clarity. This was not just a memory. It was a plan. It was the only thing that could save them. The museum was only a few blocks away. After the September bombings, it had been hastily boarded up. The most valuable exhibits were evacuated or hidden in the cellars, but much remained. The building was damaged, abandoned. There was likely no guard. The thought was monstrous, unthinkable for him. Professor Orlov, a man of the law, a guardian of history, to steal, to loot, to plunder what he himself had once protected. In wartime, the punishment for that was one thing, to be shot on the spot without trial. But then he looked at Misha again. at the thin, almost transparent neck, at the eyelashes covered in frost, and the choice ceased to exist. History, to which he had dedicated his life, had taught him one thing. Civilization is a thin, fragile layer of ice over a primordial ocean of chaos. And now, that ice had cracked. His world had collapsed. And to save his family, the professor had to die. And in his place, a thief had to be born. A hunter. A primitive man ready to do anything for fire. He slowly, painfully, got to his feet. His joints creaked like unoiled hinges. Every step was agony. But to understand how this gentle intellectual, a man who feared the sight of blood and had never raised his voice in his life, dared to venture out at night into a bombed-out city, to commit a crime punishable by death, we must go back several months, to that last, warm, and deceptively calm August of 1941, when their world had not yet turned into a frozen wasteland. August of 1941 smelled of dust, hot asphalt, and anxiety. The war was already raging at the approaches to the city. Its distant, muffled roar carried on every gust of wind. But Leningrad itself was still trying to live by the laws of peacetime. Trams were still running, cinemas were open, and women with children sat on benches in the squares by the fountains, trying to catch the last rays of the fleeting summer. The Orlov family lived in this strange, suspended state, in a cocoon of familiar rituals and everyday trifles that they hoped would protect them from the encroaching horror. Dmitri Nikolaevich still went to the university, lecturing on the history of medieval Europe to a handful of remaining students. He spoke of the Crusades, of feudal fragmentation, of the 30 Years' War, and with every word he realized more clearly that he was speaking not of the distant past, but of the present. Only the settings and names changed, but the essence of human cruelty and the struggle for survival remained the same. On his way home, he would pass windows crisscrossed with paper tape, sandbags piled against shop windows, and the increasingly common anti-aircraft guns on the roofs. The city was changing, donning a camouflage net, bristling, preparing for defense, and this preparation was more frightening than the news bulletins they listened to every evening, gathered around the black dish of the radio loudspeaker. Anna Arkadyevna, his wife, a woman with a strong practical character, tried to create an illusion of normality. She managed to find food, standing in queues for hours, mended clothes, made the children do their homework, and strictly ensured they turned off the lights during air raids. "Order is the most important thing," she would say. "As long as we have order, we can handle anything." But in her eyes, Dmitri Nikolaevich saw the fear she so carefully concealed. Fear for the children. Katya, their daughter, who just finished the 9th grade, had aged several years in those summer months. She stopped laughing, becoming quiet and focused. She joined a medical team, learned to apply bandages and carry stretchers, and this childish seriousness and readiness for adult tragedy tore at her father's heart. Misha, their youngest, seemed to be the only one who didn't notice the changes. He drove his wooden truck across the carpet, built fortresses from his father's books, and talked with excitement about the planes he saw in the sky, not understanding that these beautiful silver birds carried death. One day, on one of the last truly warm days, they all went to the Museum of Urban Life together. Dmitri Nikolaevich wanted to show Misha the toy exhibit and visit his former colleagues. The museum was already operating under wartime rules. Some exhibits were packed in crates, and the windows of the halls facing the street were blocked with sandbags. The echoing half-empty rooms smelled of mothballs and neglect. They wandered through the halls, and Dmitri Nikolaevich told the children about how people lived 100, 200 years ago. About balls and jewels, crinolines and frock coats, gas lamps and horse-drawn trams. This was his world, the world of bygone eras, so distant and safe compared to their reality. And that's when they stopped in the hall dedicated to the late 19th century. In the center stood it, that very stove. "Papa, what's that?" Misha asked, pointing his finger at the cast-iron bird on the door. "It's a stove," Dmitri Nikolaevich replied. "They called it a burzhuyka, a bourgeois stove. When houses didn't have central heating, People warm themselves with stoves like this. Is it warm? Misha pressed his small hand against the cold cast iron. No, son. It's very, very old. It's just a memory now. A museum exhibit. He looked at this elegant, useless object, and a strange feeling stirred within him. A premonition. As if this stove, this fragment of the past, was trying to tell him something. He didn't know then that it wasn't just an exhibit. It was their future savior, their Noah's Ark, their deity, to whom they would sacrifice the most precious things they had left. He didn't know yet that the smell of this museum, the smell of dust, decay, and a departed life, would become for him the scent of hope. They returned home in the evening, and that night, for the first time, the sirens truly wailed in the city. They went down to the bomb shelter set up in their building's basement. They sat in the cramped, dim space, listening to the muffled, distant explosions and the frightened cries of the neighbors' children. And when they came out onto the street after the all-clear, the air smelled of burning. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the rooftops, a fire glowed. That evening, as Dmitri Nikolaevich was putting Misha to bed, he promised him that everything would be all right, that our soldiers would soon drive the enemy away, and they would go to the museum again and eat ice cream in the summer garden. He hugged his son, breathing in the smell of his hair, unaware that the sound he would hear in a few weeks would not be the thud of an enemy shell, but the sound of a coffin lid slamming shut, the sound of the siege ring closing around their city. On September 8, 1941, German troops captured Schlisselburg. The ring had closed. Leningrad, a city with a population of nearly 3 million, was cut off from the mainland. At first, no one fully realized the gravity of the situation. People, by inertia, believed in a quick breakthrough, in help that was about to arrive. But days turned into weeks, and reality became increasingly cruel. The first blow was the bombings. The German Air Force methodically, with sadistic precision, destroyed the city. The Badaevsky Sklady food warehouses, where the main food reserves were stored, were burning. The black, acrid smoke from the burning sugar and flour shrouded the sky for several days, and this cloying, sickening smell of burning became the first scent of the siege, the scent of incinerated hope. The life of the Orlov family, like thousands of other Leningrad families, began to crumble like an old book. First, the food disappeared. The ration card system, introduced in July, now became a cruel mockery. The bread rations dwindled before their eyes. 500 grams, 400, 300. In November, workers received 250 grams, while employees, dependents, and children received only 125. This small, sticky, dark piece of bread became the measure of life. People killed for it. It was divided into crumbs, stretched out over an entire day. Anna Arkadyevna learned to make soup from carpenter's glue and patties from mustard seed cake. Leather belts, old shoes, anything that could be boiled down and swallowed went into the pot. Hunger became a constant companion. It was a dull, aching pain in the stomach, a weakness in the legs, a thick fog in the head. But then came the second, even more terrible enemy: the cold. Winter came early that year and was unusually fierce. Frosts hit as early as October, and there was no fuel in the city. Power stations operated intermittently, and soon the lights in the houses went out. Then the trams stopped, frozen on their tracks like huge steel beasts that had fallen into hibernation. The city plunged into darkness and silence, and then the cold entered the homes. The central heating was turned off. The radiators in the Orlovs' apartment grew cold and became covered with frost. At first, they tried to fight back. Dmitri Nikolaevich managed to get a small makeshift stove, a metal box with a pipe leading out of a window vent. But it needed fuel. First, old newspapers, magazines, and cardboard boxes went into the fire. They burned quickly, providing only an illusion of warmth. Then came the furniture. The old sideboard was the first to go, then the chairs, the desk, the bookshelves. Dmitri Nikolaevich himself, with his own hands, broke what had been a part of their life, their history. He chopped the polished boards with an axe, inhaling the smell of varnish and wood, and felt as if he were destroying his own home, his own past. Anna Arkadyevna cried when he approached her carved chest of drawers, a gift from her mother. Katya silently helped him, handing him splinters, her face stern and focused. Only Misha was happy about the fire, stretching his small frozen hands towards it. The most terrible day was when it was the book's turn. For Professor Orlov, this was tantamount to sacrilege. His library was his sanctuary, his soul. He had been collecting it his entire life, but the choice was simple: the books or the lives of his children. He started with Soviet encyclopedias, with works on party history, with what was less valuable. But soon, it was the turn of his favorite volumes. He remembered throwing a pre-revolutionary edition of Don Quixote into the fire. The flames eagerly licked the leather binding, and for a moment, it seemed to him that the knight of the sorrowful countenance on the cover looked at him reproachfully. That day, he understood that war burns not only cities and people. It burns culture, memory, the very soul of civilization. But the firewood from furniture and books ran out too quickly. The makeshift stove grew cold, and the cold returned, even more brutal and pervasive. The temperature in the rooms dropped below freezing. The water in the bucket turned into a solid block of ice. The ink in the inkwell froze. The walls were covered with a thick layer of frost like gray stubble. They stopped leaving one room, the smallest one, where they all lay on the bed under all the blankets and coats they had, trying to warm each other with their body heat. But that warmth was also fading. They were weakening from hunger and cold. Scurvy set in. Their gums bled, their teeth became loose. Their legs swelled and refused to obey. Apathy, the terrible siege apathy, took hold of them. Sometimes they would lie in silence for hours, half-conscious, listening to the distant cannonade and the howling wind outside. One day, Dmitri Nikolaevich tried to light the stove with the pages of his latest manuscript, a monograph on the life in the Petrine era, which he had worked on for almost 5 years. The paper burned poorly, smoked, but gave a little warmth. Misha, who was barely getting up anymore, opened his eyes for a moment and smiled faintly. And at that moment, looking at that weak, barely perceptible smile on his son's bluish face, Dmitri Nikolaevich felt something inside him snap. It was the point of no return. The last straw. He realized that passive survival, conserving energy, hoping for a miracle, it was all over. There would be no salvation. No one was coming to help them. The cold had come for them, and it would take them one by one. He looked at his useless frozen hands, at the cold stove, at the last handful of ash from his scholarly work, and then, from the depths of his freezing consciousness, that August day surfaced like a lifebuoy. The smell of museum dust, and the image of a small, elegant cast-iron stove with a bird on its door. He understood. If they wanted to live, he had to become more than just a father. He had to become a hunter. He had to go and bring fire into their ice cave. The decision, born in the depths of despair, was like a flash of lightning in their frozen, lifeless world. It illuminated the full horror of their situation and, at the same time, pointed to the only, insane, path to salvation. But between the decision and the action lay a chasm filled with fear, weakness, and the remnants of his former morality. When Dmitri Nikolaevich, staggering, got up and announced to his wife that he was going to the museum at night for the stove, Anna Arkadyevna looked at him as if he were mad. "Are you out of your mind, Dima?" she whispered with parched lips. "What stove? What museum? You won't make it there. A patrol will kill you, or you'll just freeze to death on the way. It's suicide." Her words were the voice of reason, the voice of despair that insisted it was all over and they should just lie down and wait for the end. But for the first time in weeks, Dmitri Nikolaevich wasn't listening to her. He was looking at Misha, and that gaze gave him a strength he didn't feel in his emaciated body. "If I don't go, he will die," he said firmly. "He will die tonight, or tomorrow morning. This way, we have a chance." 1 in 1,000, but we have one. He began to prepare. It was a pathetic parody of preparing for an expedition. He pulled on everything he could, 2 pairs of trousers, 3 sweaters, and an old, worn-out coat on top. He wrapped a scarf around his neck and pulled a winter hat over his head. He wrapped his feet in newspapers and put on felt boots over them. He found a small crowbar and a hammer in his toolbox. These were his weapons, his gear for the hunt for fire. Katya watched him in silence. In her large eyes, darkened by hunger, there was neither fear nor judgment. Only a quiet, adult resolve. She came up to him and placed a small piece of bread in his hand, her daily ration. "Take it, Papa," she whispered. "You need your strength." He wanted to refuse, but he looked into her eyes and knew he couldn't. This bread was not just food. It was her blessing, her faith in him. He slowly ate the precious piece, feeling the bitter taste of sawdust and hope melt on his tongue. He waited for curfew to begin. The city outside the window plunged into a dead silence, broken only by the howl of the wind and the distant roar of anti-aircraft guns. He kissed his wife, who was crying silently, pressed against the wall. He stroked Katya's head, and for a moment he leaned over Misha. The boy was breathing so quietly that Dmitri Nikolaevich feared he was already too late. He placed his numb fingers on his son's cheek. The skin was cold, icy. "I'll be back, son," he whispered. "I'll bring you warmth." And he left the apartment. The stairwell greeted him with a tomb-like cold and darkness. He descended the stairs, holding onto the railing, each step echoing loudly in the silence. The street looked like a set from a film about the end of the world. Snow-covered, deserted, lit only by the cold, ghostly light of the moon breaking through the clouds. The snowdrifts along the sidewalks concealed the frozen bodies of those who hadn't made it. Above the roofs hung the steel carcasses of barrage balloons, like giant whales frozen in the icy sky. The city was dead. But this death was deceptive. The city lived its own secret nocturnal life. Patrols could be lurking in the darkness, militiamen who would shoot without warning at any shadow that violated the curfew. There could be other, more terrifying predators, looters, murderers, those for whom the siege was a time to hunt the weak. Dmitri Nikolaevich walked, hugging the walls of the buildings, trying to stay in the shadows. The wind hit his face, choking him with icy dust. Waves of weakness washed over him, his legs buckled. He wanted to lie down right there in a snowdrift and fall asleep. But Misha's face was before his eyes, and so he walked. He crossed Nevsky Prospect, wide and deserted like a frozen river. He passed the Gostiny Dvor shopping arcade, its dark arches resembling the eye sockets of a skull. Every sound, the crunch of snow under his feet, the distant bark of a dog, the crack of a frozen branch, made his heart clench with terror. He felt like a mouse that had crept into a cage of sleeping tigers. And there was the museum building. It had been hit by a bomb. Part of the roof was destroyed, the windows were blown out and hastily boarded up. He circled it looking for a way in, and he found one. One of the basement windows was shoddily sealed. The boards could be pried off. He looked around. The street was empty. With hands trembling from cold and tension, he wedged the crowbar under a board. The wood creaked. The sound seemed deafening. He froze, listening. Silence. He pushed harder. The board gave way. He pried off another one and squeezed through the narrow opening. Inside was pitch-black darkness and that same smell. The smell of dust, decay, and cold. He lit a match. The small flame snatched the vaulted basement ceiling and shelves with some boxes from the gloom. The match burned down, searing his fingers. He lit another and began to make his way deeper, towards the stairs leading up. It was even colder in the museum halls than outside. The moonlight penetrating through the gaps in the roof created bizarre shadows. Furniture covered in white sheets resembled ghosts. The silence was so profound that he could hear the blood pounding in his temples. He walked through the familiar halls, and it felt as if he had entered the underworld. the kingdom of shadows. Here was the hall dedicated to the 18th century. Here was a display case with porcelain. Here was a portrait of an unknown nobleman who seemed to be looking at him reproachfully from his gilded frame. Finally, he reached the right hall, and he saw it. It stood in the center, small, black, covered in a layer of dust and frost. His burzhuika. He approached it and ran his hand over its icy surface. It was heavy, very heavy. He tried to lift it. Useless. His weakened body couldn't move this mass of cast iron. Despair, cold and sticky, began to rise in his throat. Was it all for nothing? Had he come all this way only to fail here, at the very goal? And then he remembered. He remembered how he and the museum's carpenter had once disassembled it for cleaning. It consisted of several parts held together by bolts. He lit another match and began to examine the stove. Yes, there they were. The bolts. Rusty. Old. But they were there. He took out his hammer and crowbar. The work was hellish. His hands wouldn't obey. His fingers were numb. Every hammer blow echoed through the museum, and it seemed to him that the sound could be heard all over Leningrad. He worked, biting his lip, losing track of time, consumed by a single task. Finally, the last bolt gave way. The stove broke into several parts, the base with legs, the firebox, the door, the top plate, and the pipe sections. Now he could carry it, piece by piece. He made the first trip, dragging the heaviest part, the firebox, to the exit. Then he went back for the rest. When he finally climbed back out onto the street, dragging the last piece behind him, he was at the end of his strength. But the journey back lay ahead, even more terrifying and dangerous. He not only had to walk himself, he had to haul his prize, his hope, his life. The first victory, the birth of a daring and insane plan, was merely a prelude to the real battle. A battle not against an enemy at the front, but against space, time, and his own failing body. The journey back from the museum to his home became Professor Orlov's own personal Calvary. The few blocks that he used to walk in 10 minutes now stretched into an eternity. He dragged the stove parts on an old children's sled he had thoughtfully brought with him. The cast iron pieces were heavy, awkward, and constantly slipped off into the snow. Every meter was gained with inhuman effort. He would walk, stop to catch his breath, and then walk again, harnessed to the rope like an exhausted barge hauler. The city no longer seemed just dead. It had become hostile. Every dark alley held a threat. Every shadow looked like a patrolman. Several times he had to abandon the sled and hide in gateways when he heard distant footsteps or the creak of runners. He would lie in the snow, holding his breath, praying not to be seen. The cold seeped under his clothes, stiffened his movements, turning him into an ice statue. But the fear of being caught was stronger than the cold. It drove him forward. When he finally reached his building's entrance, it was already beginning to get light. The pale, gray dawn filtered through the tattered clouds, making the outlines of the ruined houses look even more eerie. He was completely exhausted. He didn't even have the strength to carry his burden up the stairs. He left the sled at the bottom and crawled up to his third-floor apartment, clinging to the railing. He opened the door with his key. Anna Arkadyevna and Katya were not asleep. They were sitting huddled together, waiting. When they saw him at the threshold, covered in snow, his face gaunt and blackened but alive, Anna Arkadyevna cried out and rushed to him. He hugged her, feeling the tension of the last few hours drain away. "I brought it," he rasped. "It's downstairs. I need help." The three of them, gathering their last strength, carried the stove parts into the apartment. It was like a sacred ritual. They brought its future heart, its warm soul, into their icy home. Assembling the burzhuika in the center of the room became their first joint project in creating a new world. A world where the primary law was warmth. Dmitri Nikolaevich, fighting through the pain in his frozen fingers, tightened the bolts. Katya lit his way with a makeshift lamp made from a shell casing. Anna Arkadyevna wiped the pots with a rag, clearing away the dust of ages. Misha, hearing the commotion, opened his eyes and watched them with curiosity from his cot. When the stove was assembled, it looked like a queen at a beggar's ball in their wretched frozen room, elegant with patterns, with a mythical bird on its door. It was a symbol of another bygone life, but now it was destined to become a symbol of a new life. The main question remained: what to fuel it with? All the furniture, all the books that could be burned were already gone. And then Dmitri Nikolaevich's gaze fell on the oak parquet floor, the old, expensive parquet that they had lovingly scraped and polished in peacetime. He took the crowbar and pried up the first plank. The wood broke away from the foundation with a dry crack. It was the sound that heralded the beginning of a new era in their apartment. They tore up several boards in the farthest corner of the room so it wouldn't be too noticeable. They chopped splinters. And then came the solemn moment. Dmitri Nikolaevich crumpled a few pages from a miraculously surviving volume of Bloch's poetry, verses about the beautiful lady, and placed them in the firebox. Then a few splinters. He struck his last match. The small flame hesitantly licked the paper, then the wood. Acrid smoke billowed out, but then, as the pipe warmed up, a draft formed. The flame roared to life. He closed the door, and they waited. At first, it was a barely perceptible sensation. Then, a dry, hot air began to float through the room. The cast iron started to heat up, making a soft crackling sound. They moved closer. They held out their hands, and they felt it. Warmth. Real, living, divine warmth. It penetrated their clothes, seeped into their skin, chasing away the icy chill in their veins. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was a return to life. Misha stirred and sat up in his bed. "Warm," he whispered. And for the first time in weeks, there were childish notes in his voice. Katya began to cry. Silently, soundlessly. Tears streamed down her thin cheeks and dried instantly in the warm air. Anna Arkadyevna knelt before the stove as if before an icon and pressed her forehead against its hot side. Dmitri Nikolaevich looked at his family, at their faces illuminated by the flickering fire in the stove, and felt not triumph but a vast, all-consuming relief. He had done it. He had brought them fire. He had won. But he did not yet know that this first victory, this newfound warmth, would become the source of new, even more complex problems. It attracted the attention not only of their frozen souls. It attracted the attention of the outside world, which continued to live by its own brutal laws. The stove became the center of their universe. It was the sun around which their small, freezing planet revolved. It was the altar to which they brought sacrifices. It was the deity that gave life. With its arrival, a new civilization was born in the Orlov's apartment, with its own laws, rituals, and hierarchy. Dmitri Nikolaevich, as the high priest of this new cult, established the strictest order. He called it the Charter of the Warm House. The primary law was the law of fuel. Every piece of wood was accounted for. They only pried up the parquet at night so the neighbors wouldn't hear the noise, and they did it on a strict schedule. He started a special notebook where he recorded every burned parquet plank, every log bartered for at the market for their last valuables. This was an economy of survival where the currency was calories of heat. The second law was stove duty. They kept it burning around the clock, maintaining a steady, low fire. Every 2 hours, one of them had to add wood. The adults took the night shifts, Katya the day. It was a sacred duty upon which their lives depended. To oversleep one's watch, to let the stove go cold, was the most terrible crime. The third and most important law was the rule of warmth. Misha slept closest to the stove, on a specially arranged bed. His weakened body required constant warmth. The others were arranged around him, maintaining a strict distance. The right to sit right by the door, warming one's hands by the fire, was the highest reward, which Dmitri Nikolaevich gave for help, or simply to cheer up someone whose spirits had fallen. This system, born of chaos, gave them more than just physical survival. It gave them purpose. It turned their passive decline into an active struggle. Each day became a series of meaningful actions. Get fuel, chop splinters, maintain the fire, watch over Misha. They became a family again, a team, the crew of a small ship adrift in an icy ocean. And a miracle happened. Misha began to recover. First, a blush appeared on his cheeks. Then he started to eat the meager food they managed to find with an appetite. A week later, he was sitting by the stove, playing with wooden splinters. The warmth was bringing him back to life. The others revived too. Their scurvy symptoms disappeared. Katya had read somewhere that they should brew pine needles, and they began to drink this bitter but life-saving infusion. They found the energy to fetch water from the Neva, to stand in the bread line. Their apartment was no longer a tomb. It had become a fortress, besieged, starving but impregnable to the main enemy, the cold. They learned to hide their treasure. During the day, they kept the fire very low, so only a faint wisp of smoke came from the chimney. The windows were tightly covered with blankets so that not a single ray of light from the fire could escape. They spoke in whispers, afraid the neighbors would hear the crackling of wood. Their small, warm state was a secret to be guarded with their lives. But the more stable and predictable their life inside the apartment became, the more acute their first serious internal conflict grew. It started with something small, with the question of what to burn next. The parquet was running out. Dmitri Nikolaevich decided that the door frames would go next, then the built-in closets, the mezzanines. But Anna Arkadyevna suddenly objected. Her practical mind, which had helped them so much at the beginning of the siege, now became a source of discord. "Dima, this is madness," she said. "We can't burn the whole apartment. What will be left? We have to conserve. Only heat it at night and endure during the day." "If we endure during the day, Misha will get sick again," Dmitri Nikolaevich replied calmly. "Our task is to survive the winter. What happens to the apartment doesn't matter." "Doesn't matter?" Hysteria tinged her voice. "This is our home. It's all we have left." Their arguments became more and more heated. Anna Arkadyevna, exhausted by fear and hunger, saw her husband not as a savior, but as a destroyer. A madman who was ready to obliterate the last thing that connected them to their past life. Katya tried to reconcile them, but the tension grew. The climax came the day Dmitri Nikolaevich decided to burn the old piano that stood in the corner. It was warped and unplayable, but for Anna Arkadyevna, it was a memory of her mother. She stood before it, her arms outstretched. "Over my dead body," she said. "I won't let you touch it." At that moment, their empire was on the brink of civil war. Their small, warm world could collapse due to an internal rebellion. Dmitri Nikolaevich looked at his wife, at her face contorted with despair, and understood that force would not work here. He had to find other words. But at that very tense moment when it seemed their family would split into two warring camps, a quiet, hesitant knock came at the door. They froze. They exchanged glances. A knock on the door in besieged Leningrad rarely heralded anything good. It could be the building manager with an inspection, it could be the militia, or just someone coming to report the death of relatives. Katya tiptoed to the door and looked through the peephole. "It's Marya Ivanovna," she whispered, "the neighbor from downstairs." Their life had fallen into a harsh but predictable rhythm. But not everyone was ready to live by the laws of the new world. Someone else's misfortune had just knocked on their door. The knock on the door was like a stone thrown into the quiet pond of their established life. It broke the seal of their world, threatening to expose their greatest secret. Marya Ivanovna was a quiet, lonely old woman, a former music teacher. Her husband had been killed at the front in the first months of the war, and her children lived in another city. She rarely left her apartment, and the Orlovs had almost forgotten about her existence. "What does she want?" whispered Anna Arkadyevna, panic in her voice. "Don't open it," she added immediately. Dmitri Nikolaevich hesitated. Not to open would arouse suspicion. Why weren't they answering? What were they hiding? To open would be to let a stranger into their fortress, a person who would understand everything at once. A freezing, dying old woman couldn't fail to feel the warmth, to see the stove. The knock came again, this time weaker, more pitiful, and then they heard a faint moan from behind the door. In that moment, humanity prevailed over caution. Dmitri Nikolaevich waved his hand at Katya, and she quietly slid the bolt. On the threshold stood Maria Ivanovna. She looked like a ghost, wrapped in some unbelievable rags with a blue, weather-beaten face and huge eyes full of agony. She didn't enter. She literally collapsed into the hallway, leaning against the wall, and was seized by a fit of long, dry coughing. When she could speak, her voice was barely audible. "Forgive me, my dears," she rasped. "Some water. I don't have the strength to get to the Neva. For 3 days." And then she fell silent. Her gaze was not on them but deeper into the apartment, through the doorway leading to the room. She was looking at where the faint, yet so unreal warmth in this frozen world was coming from. She was looking at the reflections of the fire dancing on the ceiling. Her face expressed not just surprise. It was shock, a sacred awe like that of a savage seeing fire for the first time. She slowly, as if in a dream, took a step, then another. She entered the room and stopped in front of the burjuika. She stared at it, unable to utter a word. Then slowly, as if afraid it was a mirage, she stretched out her gnarled hands, swollen from cold and hunger. And when she felt the heat, a sound escaped her chest. Not quite a groan, not quite a cry of relief. She sank to the floor and just sat there, holding her hands out to the fire. The Orlov family stood silently around her, watching this scene. Their secret was out. They were now in the hands of this old, dying woman. She could go to the building manager, to the district officer. She could tell the other neighbors. And then they would come for them. They would ask where the stove came from, where the firewood came from, and everything would be over. Anna Arkadyevna looked at her husband with horror and reproach. Her gaze said, "I warned you." Katya, on the other hand, looked at the old woman with pity. Misha eyed the guest with curiosity, and Dmitri Nikolaevich was thinking. His mind, accustomed to analyzing historical situations, was frantically calculating the options. Drive her away? She would die on the stairs, and her death would be on their conscience. Besides, as she was dying, she might have time to shout about their stove. Let her stay? It was a risk. But perhaps it was also their only chance. He had to apply what history calls surgical cruelty, but in reverse, to show mercy in order to save himself. He made a decision. He approached Maria Ivanovna and gently touched her shoulder. "Drink this," he said, handing her a mug of warm pine needle broth. "And stay. Get warm. But we have an agreement." The old woman raised her tear-stained eyes to him. They held infinite gratitude and fear. "What agreement?" she whispered. "You don't say a word to anyone," Dmitri Nikolaevich said firmly, "about what you've seen here. This is our shared secret. If you tell, we will all perish. And you too, because you'll have nowhere else to get warm. Do you understand?" Maria Ivanovna nodded feverishly. "To the grave," she whispered. "Not a soul. I swear." Thus, their empire gained its first and only citizen who did not belong to the ruling dynasty. Her appearance changed their lives. They fed her from their meager supplies, shared their warmth with her, and she, in turn, became a kind of talisman for them. Her silent, grateful prayer by the stove seemed to protect their home. But her presence also became a catalyst for the internal conflict. Anna Arkadyevna could never fully accept the risk. "She'll betray us," she would whisper to her husband at night. "Old people talk. She'll let it slip in the breadline, or in a delirium." The tension in the family did not subside. The argument over the piano was unresolved and hung over them like the sword of Damocles. They had defeated the external enemy, the cold. But now they had to fight an internal enemy, distrust and fear. And they did not yet know that while they were trying to keep their little secret from one week-old woman, real, big trouble was already at their doorstep. Their secret had ceased to be a secret the moment the first wisp of smoke from their chimney rose above the roof. And someone very observant had been watching that smoke for a long time. The internal enemy had been defeated by a shaky truce. But at that very moment, fate dealt its main blow from the outside. It happened on one of those gray, featureless February days when it seemed winter would last forever. A fragile peace reigned in the apartment. Dmitri Nikolaevich, displaying miraculous diplomacy, had agreed with his wife that they wouldn't touch the piano for now and instead would dismantle the wooden mezzanines in the hallway. Maria Ivanovna, having recovered a little, was helping Katya with chores. Misha was even trying to draw with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of wallpaper. The illusion of normality was almost complete, and into this illusion, like a stone thrown through a window, came a sharp, authoritative knock on the door. It was not the quiet, pleading knock of Maria Ivanovna. It was the knock of authority. Everyone's heart sank. They exchanged glances. A deathly terror froze in Anna Arkadyevna's eyes. Dmitri Nikolaevich motioned for everyone to be silent. He tiptoed to the door and looked through the peephole. 2 men were on the landing. One was their building manager, a small, fussy man named Semyonov. Next to him was a figure in a military greatcoat and a winter hat with a star. A militiaman, or worse, the local precinct officer. "Open up! Police!" A muffled voice came from behind the door. There was no escape. Hiding was pointless. Dmitri Nikolaevich took a deep breath, trying to calm his wildly beating heart. He glanced at the room. The stove. It was hot. Smoke was coming from the chimney. It was impossible to hide it. In the corner lay a neat pile of parquet planks. The evidence was everywhere. In a second, a plan flashed through his mind. A desperate one, built on improvisation, and his only weapon, his knowledge of history. He signaled to his wife and Katya to hide Maria Ivanovna in the back room, while they sat down and tried to look as ordinary as possible. Then he turned the key in the lock. "Hello," he said, trying to make his voice sound calm and even a little surprised. The officer, a young lieutenant with a tired but hard face, entered the apartment without waiting for an invitation. The building manager scurried in behind him, trying to avoid Orlov's gaze. The lieutenant smelled of frost, cheap tobacco, and power. He scanned the hallway with a sharp, observant eye. "Orlov? Dmitri Nikolaevich?" he asked without raising his voice. "Yes, that's me. How can I help you, Comrade Lieutenant?" "You don't need to help. You need to answer. We received a report that you have an unauthorized source of heat in your apartment. Smoke is seen regularly coming from your chimney. And as you know, the city is not supplied with fuel. Where'd you get the firewood, Professor?" He said, "Professor," with a slight, barely perceptible sneer. Dmitri Nikolaevich knew this was the most important battle of his life. A battle not for warmth, but for life. "Please come in, Comrade Lieutenant," he said, trying to appear as open as possible. "What's the secret? We installed a makeshift stove, like many others. We're getting by as best we can." He led them into the room. The lieutenant stopped at the threshold, his gaze fixed on the burzhika. He slowly walked around it, squinting. The building manager, Semyonov, shuffled behind him, nervously wringing his cap. "A makeshift stove, you say?" the lieutenant grunted. "An interesting makeshift stove you have, Professor. With cast patterns, with ornaments. A fairy tale bird here. I suppose the Kirov factory is stamping these out for the blockaded citizens." A heavy silence hung in the room. Anna Arkadyevna sat on the sofa, white as a sheet, gripping Katya's hand. Dmitri Nikolaevich felt cold sweat trickle down his back, but his face remained impassive. Now, the moment had come. "Not at all, Comrade Lieutenant." He allowed himself a sad smile. "It's an heirloom. Left by my grandfather in the village. I brought it here before the war. Thought I'd put it in my dacha. It may look plain, but the cast iron is thick, holds the heat well. A simple rustic stove, pre-revolutionary, handmade. He was lying with inspiration, with artistry, pouring all his belief into every word. He, a historian, an expert on the daily life of past eras, was creating a legend on the spot, a historical background for this small but deadly artifact. The lieutenant came closer and ran his gloved hand over the cast-iron bird. "Rustic, you say?" He turned and looked at the pile of parquet. "And the firewood, I take it, is also from your grandfather? Parquet firewood?" The blow was precise. It was a trap. Dmitri Nikolaevich felt the ground give way beneath him, but he couldn't surrender. "Of course not." He spread his hands with disarming candor. "The parquet, yes, that's ours. I admit we're breaking the rules. But, Comrade Lieutenant, you see..." He nodded towards Misha, who was staring at the men in fear. The child. He was freezing to death. "We're not tearing our home apart for firewood because life is good. And we're not the only ones. The whole city is living like this." It was a strong move, an appeal to their shared misfortune, to the humanity that must still remain even in this tired, hardened man. The lieutenant was silent for a long time. He looked from the stove to the children, then into the professor's eyes. Dmitri Nikolaevich held his gaze, though everything inside him was screaming with terror. He knew the lieutenant didn't believe him. He had probably figured it all out. The elegant casting, the characteristic shape. This was no village craftsmanship. It was an expensive factory-made city stove. Perhaps he had even seen ones like it in museums or antique shops before the war. The fate of the Orlov family hung by a thread. It depended on the decision this man would make. Would he believe this hastily concocted legend? Or would he show official zeal and start digging for the truth? And, as the professor knew, the investigation into looting from the museum was ongoing. The punishment for that was death by firing squad. "All right," the lieutenant finally said, and the word made Dmitri Nikolaevich's breath catch in his throat. "We'll deal with the parquet. I'll write you a fine. Semyonov will see to it. But not another plank. Understood?" "Understood, Comrade Lieutenant. Thank you for your understanding," the professor managed to force out. "Don't thank me," the lieutenant replied harshly. He was already heading for the exit, but at the doorway he turned back and looked at the burjuika one last time. "And the stove. It's a good one. Take care of it, Professor. Things like this, they hold history." He left. The building manager, muttering something unintelligible, slipped out after him. The door slammed shut. For a few seconds there was absolute silence in the room. And then Anna Arkadyevna silently slid from the sofa to the floor. She hadn't fainted. She simply couldn't stand any longer. Katya rushed to her, and Dmitri Nikolaevich went to the window and watched as the two figures disappeared across the snow-covered courtyard. He had won. He had defended his fortress. He had won the most terrifying battle of his life. But the price of this victory was enormous. He realized the lieutenant had known everything. That last phrase about history was an unmistakable hint. He hadn't arrested them not because he believed the lie, but because in this hell, where the laws of civilization had ceased to function, he had made his own, human choice. He had given them their lives. But with this gift, he left them with the knowledge of just how thin a thread their salvation had hung by. They had been on the verge of complete collapse, but they had seen the first sign of hope. The hope that humanity was not yet completely dead. The lieutenant's visit was, for the Orlov family, what military science calls a Pyrrhic victory. They had survived, their secret formerly remained unexposed, but the illusion of safety was shattered forever. They now lived with the constant feeling of being watched, that their fragile well-being depended on the mercy of a single man who could change his mind at any moment. Fear became their second, invisible neighbor. Anna Arkadyevna fell into a deep depression. She barely spoke, sitting for hours by the window, flinching at every sound on the staircase. The conflict over the piano was forgotten. A consuming terror took its place. "He'll come back," she would whisper at night. "They'll come for us, Dima. Why did you start all this? We would have died quietly, like everyone else." Dmitri Nikolaevich had to be not only a provider of fuel and a keeper of the flame, but also a psychologist, a comforter, a rock against which his wife's waves of despair crashed. But he too was plagued by doubts. He had saved his family, but at what cost? He had broken the law, lied to a representative of the state, and now their life was built on a lie. He, a professor of history, had become a character in his own dark historical chronicle. But winter, however endless it seemed, was coming to an end. In March, it grew slightly warmer. Sometimes the sun would even appear, and its pale rays, falling on the snow, seemed like a promise of new life. And then came the news that swept through the dying city like a clap of thunder. On January 18th, 1943, the troops of the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts broke through the siege ring. It was not the end yet. Full liberation was still far off, but it was a turning point. The first trains with food began to move into the city through a narrow corridor carved through the German positions. Bread rations began to increase slowly, gram by gram. Electricity returned to the city, at first for a few hours a day. Life, it seemed, was returning. The euphoria of salvation was short-lived. It was quickly replaced by an awareness of the scale of the losses and a confrontation with a new reality. The city was in ruins. Hundreds of thousands of people had died. The survivors were physically and mentally exhausted. But for the Orlov family, their own secret problem was added to the general tragedy. The Burzhuika, their savior, their deity, had now become dangerous evidence, an object that linked them to a crime. While the struggle for survival was raging, moral torment could be pushed aside. But now that the immediate threat of death had receded, conscience spoke up loud and clear. Dmitri Nikolaevich suffered the most. He, a guardian of history, had stolen a piece of it. He understood that the stove had to be returned to its place. It was not just a matter of fear of exposure. It was a matter of honor, a matter of restoring the order of things he had violated. One evening, as they sat by the cooling stove, they used it much less often now, conserving the last of the parquet, he told his family, "We have to return it." Anna Arkadyevna looked at him in amazement. "Return it? Have you lost your mind?" "Why? Let it be. No one will remember it. The museum is destroyed. Who needs it?" "History needs it," Dmitri Nikolaevich replied firmly. "It's not ours. We borrowed it. Now that time is up. We have to repay the debt." Katya, who always understood her father perfectly, supported him. "Papa is right. It's the right thing to do." Even Misha, who loved the stove more than anyone, agreed. Thus began the final act of their drama, Operation Return. It was no less dangerous than the operation to steal it. Now they had to not only get the stove out of the house, but also secretly return it to the museum, which, though in ruins, was no longer completely deserted. Committees for damage assessment had begun work there. They were clearing the rubble. They could be seen, caught. And then they would have to explain what they were doing with a museum exhibit in the middle of the night. They once again waited for a dark, moonless night. Once again, they disassembled the stove into parts. Once again, they loaded it onto the children's sled. And once again, Dmitri Nikolaevich and a grown-up, stronger Katya set off through the night city. This journey was completely different. The city was no longer so dead. Here and there, a dim light burned in windows. Military trucks occasionally drove through the streets. The danger of being noticed was higher. But now they were driven not by the fear of death, but by a sense of duty. They reached the museum. The hole in the basement, luckily for them, remained unsealed. They dragged the stove parts inside into that very hall. And there in the moonlight, among the sheet-covered ghosts of furniture, they assembled it again. When the last bolt was tightened, Dmitri Nikolaevich ran his hand over its no longer icy but simply cool surface. He mentally said goodbye to it, thanked it for the lives it had saved. They left it standing in the middle of the hall, exactly where it had stood before their intrusion. A little sooty, with light scratches, but whole, their silent accomplice, their savior. They returned home at dawn, tired but with a sense of duty fulfilled. Their personal war was over. Their feat, their crime, all of it was buried in secrecy. Their brotherhood, forged by the fire of a stolen stove, was sealed by this last shared oath of silence. The war ended. The city, slowly, painfully, was reborn from the ruins. It healed its wounds, rebuilt its destroyed palaces, returned to life. The Orlov family returned too, to that same civilization from which they had been exiled by the siege. But this return was only external. Inside, they forever remained inhabitants of that ice cave, denizens of their small, secret empire of warmth. Dmitri Nikolaevich went back to work at the university. He lectured again, wrote articles, participated in academic conferences, but his colleagues noticed that the professor had changed. He had become quiet, withdrawn. Sometimes he would freeze in the middle of a lecture, staring at a single point, as if listening to something only he could hear. He never again studied the history of daily life. His new subject became the psychology of survival, the history of the human spirit in inhuman conditions. But he never wrote or spoke anywhere about the most important experience of his life. His feat remained his personal, unspoken pain. Anna Arkadyevna never fully recovered from the horror she had endured. For the rest of her days, she had a morbid fear of the cold. Even on the warmest summer days, she would wrap herself in a shawl. She created a cult of food and warmth in their apartment, constantly cooking, forcing everyone to eat, ensuring the house always had a stock of food and firewood for the fireplace they installed after the war. Her fear, her siege trauma, remained with her. Katya grew up to be a doctor. She chose the most difficult specialty, resuscitation. She saved people, pulling them back from the brink of death. And only her closest friends and family knew that behind her professional composure and decisiveness lay the memory of how she, a little girl, had kept the fire going in a stove to save her dying brother. Misha survived. He grew up to be a healthy, strong man, an engineer builder. He rebuilt the destroyed Leningrad. He built new houses with central heating, with hot water, with large, bright windows. He built a world where no child would ever have to freeze in their own apartment again. But he never remembered that terrible winter. His childhood memory, to save itself, had erased the most horrific recollections. He only remembered the warmth, a mysterious, miraculous warmth that had saved him. He didn't know where it came from and never asked. It was a taboo subject in their family. Maria Ivanovna, their unwitting accomplice, survived the siege. She lived for several more years after the war, quietly and inconspicuously. Sometimes she would meet the Orlovs in the courtyard. They would nod to each other in silence. And in her eyes, Dmitri Nikolaevich saw gratitude and understanding. They were bound by a single secret, and that secret died with her. And what about the precinct officer, the lieutenant who had given them their lives? Dmitri Nikolaevich tried to find him several times after the war, to say thank you. But he couldn't. All traces of him were lost. Perhaps he died at the front, or was simply lost in the chaos of the post-war years. He remained for them a nameless guardian angel, a man who at a crucial moment chose mercy over the law. One day, already an old man, Dmitri Nikolaevich took his grandson to the Museum of Urban Life. The museum had been fully restored. It shone with fresh paint and polished parquet floors. They walked through the halls, and the professor told the boy about the past. And then they entered that very hall, and he saw it. It stood in its place, polished, well cared for. A plaque read, "Heating stove, cast iron, molded, late 19th century." People walked past, casting indifferent glances at it. To them it was just an old, beautiful object. No one knew that this stove was not just an exhibit, that it had been a warrior, that it had fought in the most terrible battle in the city's history, that its small cast-iron firebox had been a blast furnace where despair was smelted into hope, that it had been the heart that had kept an entire family from dying. The professor stood before it for a long time, and his grandson couldn't understand why there were tears in his grandfather's eyes. He placed his small hand on the cold cast iron. "Grandpa, it's beautiful," he said. "Yes," replied Dmitri Nikolaevich. "It's not just beautiful, it is alive." He was buried in an old cemetery. He took his secret with him. The story of his family became just one of the millions of stories of Leningrad survivors. Ordinary, unremarkable. But as was told in their family for generations, every winter during the coldest frosts, someone would leave a few pine cones and a bundle of dry splinters on his grave. No one knew who it was. Thus ends the documentary chronicle of the Orlov family. But its story does not end there. Official archives, military reports, museum catalogs, they do not keep such tales. You will not find mention of the professor's nightly expedition, of the trial of conscience, or of the silent agreement with the precinct officer. The soulless machine of history grinds up such private human dramas, leaving only dry facts, casualty figures, and battle dates. But real history does not live in archives. It lives in memory. And when official memory falls silent, a legend is born. The story of Professor Orlov and the stolen stove became such a legend. It was not told loudly. It was passed down in whispers like the most precious family heirloom from children to grandchildren. It was said that the spirit of that nameless lieutenant still protects all who, in a difficult moment, choose compassion. There was a belief among museum workers that the stove in the 19th century hall sometimes, on the coldest winter nights, becomes faintly warm, as if remembering its main, heroic mission. This story became a parable that in the fight against absolute evil, be it war, hunger, or cold, salvation comes not from great strength, but from a small but living fire, the fire in a cast-iron stove, the fire in a human heart. It is a story about how sometimes, to preserve civilization within oneself, one must break its external laws, about how the greatest feats are performed not on battlefields to the roar of cannons, but in the silence of freezing apartments, where one person decides to save their loved ones, no matter the cost. The story of the Orlov family is not just a chronicle of survival. It is a reminder that man's greatest weapons have always been not the sword or the rifle, but intelligence, will, and the capacity to love. And that even the darkest and coldest museum exhibit can become a source of light and heat if touched by the hand of a person driven to despair, but who has not lost hope.